Hello, I am Cici Zhang, and in this presentation, I will be looking at the architecture of the London terraces, what purpose the structure had toward London during 1727 to 1930, how this purpose changed over time, and how the space of certain terraces facilitated towards their reason of construction. The map above shows areas which the United Kingdom had power over in the 19th century. During this century, there was a great expansion, illustrated by the orange highlighted areas. These are the locations the kingdom had influence over. Those locations were present-day Australia, India, Canada, and a slim part of southern Africa. The next map is of London in the 18th to 19th century and highlights key areas such as Bedford Square in the red circle, the Adelphi in the blue circle, and Carlton Terrace in the orange circle. These were the locations of prominent housing designated for the middle and the wealthy population of London. Though terrace housing during this time period did facilitate for the overpopulation of England at the time, however, the most preserved terraces were of higher class. And from the illustration, you can see how London was planned on a different axis against the River Thames. During 1727 to 1760 was the reign of King George II, whose governmental actions were mostly led by Sir Robert Walpole. Later, after King George II died in 1760, King George III continued the Georgian reign. However, it would be cut short due to his death in 1811. There would be a 9-year regency period. During that time, the development of Regent Street would start under John Nash. From 1837 to 1901, Queen Victoria ruled the United Kingdom. From 1850 to 1870, historians labeled the 20-year period Britain's golden years because of the increase of industrialization in textile and machinery, and England becoming a worldwide network of trade. However, housing conditions for the working class wasn't sustainable, and reforms in the new industrial conditions were set by Parliament. For instance, in 1842, England was scandalized for using children for work in the coal mines. In response, Parliament created the Mines Act in 1842, which prohibited the employment of girls and boys under the age of 10 from working underground in coal mines. From the Victorian period, there would be a reemergence in 1910 with King George IV during his reign of World War I commencing and ended in his time of rule, which during that time there would be a demolition and this reconstruction of different and certain buildings in London. This timeline for London specifically dates the 1720s, where new Georgian buildings were being erected, and London becoming a huge national resource market. During the 1700s to the 1800s, London's population rose from about 600,000 in 1700s to an additional 350,000 increase in population in 1800s. Islington and Chelsea also experienced a similar growth in population. As population grew, so did construction in London, specifically in housing facilities, due to the population spike. In response, codes were made governing sustainable construction. A particularly important one is the Building Act of 1774, which governed the minimum wall thickness and other standards for all subsequent housing. In the 1800s, population of London rose sevenfold to over 6,500,000. 1841 to 1851, number of English towns residency and urban accommodations rises. Meanwhile, several large local authorities had from the 1840s been instituting their own building codes, so that within a general uniformity, houses built under the bylaws had many variations of plans and layout. 1911, the British population doubled, and 79% of the population lived in towns. 1930, in the 1930s, most people with a stable work placement, the living standards had rose significantly. However, housing was still not great. A survey conducted from 1929 to 1930 in London calculated almost 10% of the population were living from a minimum level. The next timeline illustrates important dates of terraces I will be explaining later in my presentation. In 1727, the development of Governors Squares began and would be one of the first areas of London to become a trademark toward Georgian architecture with its terrace housing. In 1768, the Adelphi scheme was commerced by Robert Adam. This was an important year in the architectural history of London because there was a renewed taste for coherence and uniformity initiated by town planning and architecture of the capital. The construction of Bedford Square in 1775, London would witness a remarkable maturity in its domestic architecture that set guidelines for the refinement and elegance of the remainder of the Georgian era. In 1820, during the reign of the Regency, the destruction of the Carlton House would commence and the development of residential areas. Finally, in the 1930s, parts of the Adelphi area configured by Robert Adams were destroyed, and additions to certain areas of the Adelphi began. A present-day map of London in 1938 illustrates the area in a broader encapsulation. Here we see from the map the growth of the metropolis in London from the compact spacing in the map, 4 buildings that were being developed in London. In the 18th century, terrace housings had been designed for the inhabitation of either servants and the wealthy. The wealthy terrace housings would be distinguished by the facades on the structures, by the pediment or other ornate detailing. Servants' terrace housings would mimic the grander terrace housings. Socially, it was almost to connect the servants to the wealthy family as one household. Servants were amazed by this new dwelling facility as they were able to have their own separate quarters from their serving household. However, the purpose for terrace housing would change in the 19th century, as London witnessed a massive expansion of Britain's urban population. Increasing population size presented a massive challenge to the British building industry. The solutions were to build blocks. Blocks were lines of terrace housing, as they would be able to accommodate many families in either narrow space or different level. In between 1841 and 1851, one decade, many English towns grew in population size, and at the midpoint of the century, over half the population would inhabit terrace housing. Between 1851 and 1911, population continued in growth to doubling in numbers, whilst the urban side would increase 3 times by 1911. About 3/4 of people lived in towns with blocks of terrace housing. Terraces had become a long-term solution for an attempt in accommodating the people to sustainable housing facilities. However, the axially linear lines of houses were also for London's desire of palatial unity in towns that were inherited from the Italians. Priorly stated, London terraces in the 17th century had just been a simple housing unit for servants or the wealthy. Usually, the space of the terrace housing were longer by length than by width, and vertically tall, forming a slim rectangular area of space. The configuration of these rectangular slim spaces allowed there to be many blocks of rows of terrace housings in many different areas or edges in a uniform way. The rectangular form would provide a solution towards 18th and 19th century London's overpopulation it was experiencing, being able to form suburban areas in different locations of London and fill them in with blocks of terrace housings to allow English families a dwelling space. Though the wealthier population had similar geometrical style to the working class facilities, they would be wider, such as the Carlton Terrace would be wider in width and taller in height, with multiple levels of rectangular space, while the working class terrace housings had smaller width and length, and usually 2 levels and rarely 3 levels in height. The organization of terrace housing would be axially planned due to it following a linear road or bounding a rectangular area of space like the Covent Garden or Bedford Square. London terraces would have stonework implemented into them, and were most common during the period 1860 and 1930, due to stonework improving in quarrying, cutting, and transport. It wasn't status, stone that changed, but different kinds of stonework were preferred. There were several different surface treatment, but a major one was this rubble work or rough stonework, often seen more in the 19th century housing, offering a homier look, and was argued that smaller, irregular stones were more solid. However, earlier London terrace housings usually combined a variety of brick to form the geometry of the dwelling space for the English population, as it was more structural for its practicality and cheapness against stone. There were different techniques and materials that made it structurally possible and sustainable configuration of the terrace houses. One technique implemented were the arches. Covering the openings, they became self-supporting. The most common arch solution was called the flat arch, or in brickwork, the skew back arch. Therein, there are other several segmental arches, such as the camber arch, with a very slight curve. The doors in almost all the terrace houses, except for the small ones, were covered by a semicircular arch. After the 17th and 18th century, they would become gauged arches, meaning that the bricks would be radially shaped as a way to spread the masonry pressure sideways. Stucco was popularly used in the 1830s as an external decorative look to cover rough walls with rendering and rough cast for protection, frequently at the back of the terrace housing, while the use of stucco at the front was to cover the cheap brick underneath. Stucco was also considered cheaper than stone by 75%, and even cheaper than wood. Additionally, elements toward the use of stucco was the Building Acts forbade the use of wood on facades. The material would be implemented to finish a plain face, the formation of ornament, and to be jointed to imitate stone. Underneath some stucco decor, there was wood and iron snaps, acting as support towards the ornamentation of the house. In conjunction to the trend in the 20th century of painting the front as a more utilitarian rendering, rough casting, or lime washing, there was pointing. Pointing were fine mortars that often filled the joints between the bricks on the facade. Pointing, as distinct from jointing, refers to the treatment or covering of the joint on the face of the wall. There are many kinds of pointing, such as flushed, flat, struck, recessed, keyed, or tuck. Most frequently found and expensive is tuck pointing, as shown in the right image through the letter H, that had a small protrusion out the brick facade. There were like stucco, used to intensify a decor quality toward the housing, in this case, color, or change the appearance of the brick facade. London terraces were prominently built in the style of architecture during Georgian London, but before we get into the architectural style of London terraces that followed, the cultural context is important to understand so we may understand how the style was formulated. Georgian architecture was formulated during the Georgian era, starting with the ascension to the throne King George I in 1714 and ended with King George IV in 1830. The Georgian period was a period of great change since city life grew. There was an expansion of trade, consumerism, and culture bloomed from the construction of ports. The period also witnessed a start of industrialization, repression, radicalism, and wider gap between extreme luxury and poverty. Population of Britain had a rapid growth in numbers from 5 million in 1700s, then towards the 1800s raised by another 4 million increase. During this time, people started leaving the countryside in search of new work opportunities. In other nearby cities and towns, London would be particularly flooded with a lot of young people every year who were seeking out work, like being apprentices to numerous tradesmen who were from the capital. Other new arrivals tried employment in other occupations, such as being a domestic servant to several aristocratic families who were beginning to spend their time in elegantly built terraces or townhouses. Georgian style of Britain developed during 1740, as previously mentioned, with the rise of King George I, until 1830 with the death of King George IV. The life of London, the person in power and studies that architects read were factors in defining the basic concepts toward Georgian architecture. For example, in the Georgian period, architects would study Italian Renaissance architecture, like Andrea Palladio's Palladianism, which I will discuss more in detail later with Inigo Jones, or with Prince George in 1811, who favored the taste of the architect John Nash, whose style reflected the typical features found in Georgian architecture, features such as symmetrical principles of Palladianism and neoclassicism with arches, Doric and Ionic columns, and pediments from Greek and Rome influence. As aforementioned, London during the 18th and 19th century was experiencing a dramatic population growth and expansion. In accommodation towards these issues, architects would build terrace housings. However, designs of these terrace housings would follow the time period's architectural preference, which was Georgian architecture. Georgian is the term to refer toward the historic period in Britain that corresponds to the reign of the Georgian monarch. Since the features in Georgian architecture ultimately reflected towards the taste of the monarch in the time, features of Georgian architecture for terrace housings included houses were arranged in a sequence of blocks stretching the edges of the piazza, which were rectangular, enclosed, or open spaces. These blocks were rows of multi-storied high housing units that were later instances would have been the same width measurement throughout. Georgian architecture for George's reign took interest of the 15th century architect Inigo Jones' configurations, which were highly based on Palladianism. The style features some ornamentation by either the columns, but its elegance was held together by the overall geometry of space and facade, which reflected the appearance of Italian Renaissance palace with the semicircular arches. Georgian architecture's features would be integrated in London terraces during 18th to 19th century in London from the English architect Inigo Jones, had set the stones through his design of the Covent Garden. He would take inspiration from his studies in the architecture of Italian Renaissance. One of the architects he'd study was Andrea Palladio and his Palazzo Dine. Andrea Palladio was an Italian architect who developed a type of architecture called Palladianism, or Palladian architecture, which Inigo Jones would integrate towards his buildings in London. Palladian architecture, or Palladianism, was defined for its features of being symmetrical, having a perspective, and following the values of formal classical temple architecture during the times of ancient Greece and Rome. Andrea Palladio's Palazzo Dine is one of the structures that follows such a style, and Jones took features from it towards his work in London. Palazzo Dine's arches at the first level, the widths measurements diagrams the facade into proportional vertical parts. As previously mentioned, Inigo Jones was a prominent architect in England in the 15th century. Jones had been the first English architect to understand and study the new systems of architecture formulated from the Italian Renaissance, such as Palladianism, developed by Palladio. He was granted permission to design the Covent Garden for the Earl of Bedford. The urban layout he followed from his studies of the Italian Renaissance, a rectangular, symmetrical square with regularized facade. However, it is Jones' detail to what formulated the edges that bounded that square area. There were blocks of terrace housings, buildings that reflected the work of Palladio's structures for Grand Palazzo facades, such as the Palazzo Tyne. Jones integrated the large order of pilasters or columns, each with appropriate cornices and further ornaments. Jones Covent Garden terraces design would be the basis for London's terrace housings designs in the next few centuries. And this would be Covent Garden. As well, as you can see, the edges that he was talking about were the terrace housings around here. And you can see the Palazzo Tyne's influence through the fact that the arches in the first level actually diagrams the vertical facades quite well, just like Palladio did with Palazzo Tyne. Before we get into any of the terraces that I'm talking about, we must know a little bit about the architect, such as Robert Adams was a Scottish neoclassical architect, interior designer, and furniture designer, born on July 3rd, 1728, son of Scotland's foremost architect William Adams, who he trained under along with his older brother John. Robert would take on the family business that was assigned a profitable work from the Board of Ordnance after his father's death. His work would include, most notably, in London, the Adelphi project with the Adelphi terraces, Admiralty Screen in Kedleston Hall. The next architect, Thomas Leverton, an English architect born in Waltham Abbey, Essex, in 1743, was baptized. Leverton was the son of a builder. His father was Lancelot Leverton. As a result, Leverton began his studies from his father's trade, and there acquired the skills in architecture with the help of patrons. Later in life, Leverton designed houses both at the countryside and London, such as Plaistow Lodge, Wotton Wood Hall, and he was referenced to have designed Bedford Square because some of the houses were designated to him. John Nash, born in 1752, he was undoubtedly one of the most prominent architects in England and was involved in the architectural configurations of London. To its structures include his notable solo designs are the Buckingham Palace, Marlborough Arch, and Royal Pavilion, while for collaboration works, some of the well-known projects were Regent Street, Regent Parks and its terraces, and Carlton House Terrace. The Adelphi was the most notable work of Robert Adams, one of the Adam brothers. The structure began developing during the years 1768 to 1774. The scheme involved the construction of the Adelphi terraces situated at the west of Adam Street and Robert Street, while respectively east. At the northeast corner of the terrace was the Yorks Building. Along the north was John Street, and parallel to the Durham House Street. It sat on a platform above the River Thames. The development was on a monumental scale, as it contained houses and several streets. The Adelphi terraces were used as housing units, most likely to house the wealthy than the working class, due to the pediments and ornamented pilasters and entablatures. The scheme was financially ruinous for the brothers, who, despite running a successful lottery for the houses, narrowly avoided bankruptcy. In the 1930s, the center of the Adelphi was demolished. However, vaults and several houses at the side terraces survived, but greatly altered. Adelphi Terrace formed the most extensive individual group of houses. The plan shows how the Adams innovatively compacted no more than 69 houses into the compressed former site of Durham Yard, which is between present-day Charing Cross, and Waterloo Bridge. Although the plan of each housing units may seem the same, each individually have their own different ornamental features or furnitures, such as chimneys, housing units also along the royal terrace were larger and more opulent. However, the repetition of the housing is found by the rectangular area of space each housing unit is bounded by for occupants that defined terrace housings in London. The width measurements for each rectangular square area is equal throughout the streets and modular. The plan shows that the Adam brothers had an axially planned the placement of units forming a modular grid, a common feature towards London terrace house planning, as each similar space is similar to the one before it. The main terrace overlooks the river and was palace fronted with pilasters and crowning balustrades parallel to a block over at John Street. The two terraces form an implied square from the river. Robert Adams, the main designer for the Adelphi scheme, out of all the brothers, might have put some architectural features that would be defined towards neoclassical in other buildings. However, the terraces themselves followed the proportional facade of Palladianism, which Jones had brought to London. The rectangular windows all aligned to three horizontal segments following the symmetry. The classical features of the columns and arches on the platforms helped to form a grid over the facade similar to the Palazzo Thines facade, and hints or ornamentation etched in stucco, but not overwhelming to distract from the proportional, emphasize it being part of Georgian architecture Jones defined through his studies on Palladianism. Designed by Thomas Leverton for the Duke of Bedford Estates, it was a terrace housing, just as the previous one. Its main reason for construction was to house the English population. However, due to its ornamentation, it was likely for high middle class in England. The aim for the ground landlord of Bedford, as a freeholder, was to have a large well-built house put up to attract a good class of tenants, as to maintain the financial and social standing of the estate. The houses reflect this goal of housing either middle class or wealthier tenants due to the pediment and the columns engaged at the doorways. Bedford Square had been London's first example of a square with a consistent uniformity. It had been governed by many variables such as land ownership, money supply, and the demand for housing. Today it serves as the most complete and preserved of all Georgian squares in London. The plan illustrates the four-sided uniform palace-fronted terraced housing forming a piazza, perfect symmetrical area of a square space. However, unlike the predecessor of Jones' Covent Garden, with a central space being occupied by an oval garden piece, the once static rectangular geometry of the place becomes dynamic in the persuasion of a circumambulation through the square instead of a hard implied edge of boundaries. The square was almost located near the British Museum, which in planning would emphasize the social standing of the estate being near an intellectually driven structure in its premise. The square can be divided into symmetrical and proportional grid as its organizational scheme. The Bedford Square terrace houses had multiple levels of space in each housing unit of the Bedford Square. Usually the first floor would have a large area of space at the entrance with a room behind the staircase location. The standard floor structure followed the principles set by the floor below. In the front room, two large main beams were positioned at points equidistant from and running parallel with the walls, gaining support from the bearing on the brick piers between three windows on the front wall. The other end, one of them was supported by the brickwork of the staircase compartment, meeting the spine wall, while other borne by the spine wall itself, including a deep timber lintel over the doorway through the rear room. This final beam either continued through the rear wall or run to either side of the chimney breasts. The structure of the second floor would be a duplicate of the one below, except the front room, often divided or smaller size. The change in size difference between levels may be due as the first level was the entrance or the front should be longer to accommodate house guests, and as you go higher, the front will be smaller and the back larger because those were areas of more privacy. Bedford, as previously mentioned, served as one of the most preserved Georgian squares in London and one of the most uniformal. As seen by the elevations of Bedford Square, the housing units followed the proportional linear placement of Georgian terrace housing. The space each housing unit bounds are rectangular in form, placed modularly within the plan. The facade follows Andrea Palazzo's design of a palace front facade with a semicircular arch resembling a triumphal arch. The facade once again follows the Palladianism's strict proportionality and symmetry that Georgian architecture integrated during the time period. The plan configuration is reflective of Jones Covent Garden, having edges and boundaries of the piazza formed by the lines of terrace housing. The Carlton House was a structure that was going to conjoin towards the scheme in improving St. James Park, which was located along the street of St. James District in the city of Westminster of London. However, the structure was pulled down from the development in the site. The ruler during that time period put a larger sum of money on the site for Carlton area, and it was intending to form the southern end of Regent Street that was being developed by the architect John Nash. However, by the time he took the throne, Carlton area fell to favor with the Buckingham Palace as the preferred place for royal residency. Therefore, the construction of the Carlton area, the development of the gardens and site was for the purpose of a residential area now. Nash produced the Carlton Terrace with terrace houses, which in the design integrated use of pediments and columns. These ornate details and the occasional house size that would be wider than most normal terrace housing, spanning about 30 feet, would indicate that these terrace houses were to be housed by the wealthy English population. The Carlton Terrace's main architectural feature was a pair of white stucco-faced house terraces, which on the south side of the street was overlooking St. James Park. Between 1827 and 1832, the terraces were built on crownland by John Nash in collaboration with who helped with the process of the Carlton Terraces were James and Decimus Burton. The terrace housing followed the typical modularity of previous terrace houses, as each housing module would be formulated around a linear axis and be placed into a block that formed bounded edges around a private area of space, the Carlton Gardens. Nash would lay out the remaining piece of the Carlton House Gardens with 7 units, 2 facing parallel to each other, with an oval grass centerpiece in between with the other units in a single block up the north side of the Carlton House Street, forming such boundaries of the Carlton Garden with which the terrace housing figures the edges to become more of a secluded area against the part from the public. The Carlton Terrace being the latest of the 3 terrace examples, it is ornate than the rest, having a colonnade running in front of the facade. However, the spacing in between each of the columns served to further emphasize the Palladianism found within the building's configuration, as it still resembles toward Georgian architecture in having a palace-based front facade with rectangular windows and arches that help to formulate a grid that proportionally segments the structure into the strict symmetry Palladianism is known for, and the terrace housings are placed into blocks that follow the linear axis with uniformity in each unit placed harmoniously. Similar to Covent Garden, the blocks of terraces once again form edges and boundaries toward a rectangular piazza. The structure also incorporates the Georgian style's taste of neoclassical and classical form from the integration of the pediments and columns. And that is the end of my presentation. These are a few key terms that I have used throughout my presentation that is important to understanding the architecture of London terraces. And here's my bibliography. Thank you for listening to my presentation, and I wish you a nice day.